You do not know me, so you won't understand why it matters until you do. On a bright Saturday morning, I stepped out to wash my old Ford in the driveway, soap suds running off the bumper like little silver rivers, and by lunchtime I had the whole neighborhood whispering and an HOA president declaring me the troublemaker. That's the short version, and if you stick around I'll tell you the long one, the one with forged papers, late-night trespassers, a county audit, and the kind of small, ugly choices that end up revealing who we really are. My name's Hank Mercer. I'm in my late 60s, retired from 40 years of civil engineering, hands that still know the weight of steel and wet concrete. I live on a corner lot in Lakewood Ridge. That's the new name for the subdivision since someone decided Lakeview sounded too generic, and I like the ritual of Saturday morning chores. Coffee, the paper, the hose, a little music. It's simple. It's mine. It's also the thing that set off a woman named Vivian Clark, who ran our homeowners association like she'd been appointed mayor for life. Vivian always had that look, immaculate blazer, low-key jewelry, a smile that starts at her lips and stops at her eyes, and the sort of voice that makes people think, oh well, of course. She loved rules the way some people love crossword puzzles. She loved the feeling of being first to know something, of deciding things. A lot of people like that in a leader. A few of us felt a chill whenever the decisions started to smell like one person's taste. So I was out there, rinsing the truck, when she pulled into the cul-de-sac. She didn't bother to walk up the driveway, just rolled down the window and asked, more like informed, that I set the pressure washer aside, because it wasn't permitted on wash day under the HOA's Spirit of the Community clause. I laughed, because who writes rules about pressure washers? Vivian didn't laugh. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone and started recording. That's how this whole thing went viral in our little world. A woman in a blazer and starched collar filming me rinsing my tailgate while she called it an offense against community standards. I told her to stop recording. She smiled that same thin smile and said, for the record, as if the camera made her words law. The sheriff showed up after some neighbors called 911, not because I'd done anything criminal, mind you, but because one neighbor saw her filming and assumed confrontation. There was no arrest, no charges. Still, when she drove off, Vivian left a voicemail on every household's listed number. Please be reminded of our community standards. It was soft, it was polished, and it landed like a warning. If that had been the end, some weird, petty moment swept away by the mundane churn of life, I might have laughed and gone back to my coffee. Instead, that voicemail was the first of 1,000 little nudges that turned into snow. Notice after notice, fine after fine, a neon violation sign planted on my front lawn one morning like a stake in the ground. Vivian started sending emails. They were ornate, full of rules I'd never read in the covenants, fines for unapproved exterior maintenance, notices about unauthorized use of utility equipment, demands for community compliance. The language was polite and precise, which is to say it was merciless. She issued a $500 fine for what she called public nuisance, and then an administrative fee for processing noncompliance. It felt like being billed for breathing. I collected everything. Old men like me, engineers and the sort, live by evidence. I put the notices in a folder, took photos of the truck with timestamps, saved the voicemails. I didn't want to fight. I wanted to be able to show that this was absurd. But a thing happens when someone with that much authority starts pointing, and people start to look away for fear, for convenience, for the simple math of small-town politics. If you're on her good side, you get allowed to ignore her inconsistency. If you're not, you're an example. My friend Roy stopped over, because Roy always stops when there's trouble. He's the kind of neighbor who brings over spare tools, and, if you're down, a six-pack. He looked at the notices and said, Hank, that's not right. Samira, a schoolteacher across the street, knocked and slipped a printed county statute through my mail slot about homeowners association governance. I started calling people. The county clerk, the Office of Community Standards. It was slow at first, the kind of bureaucratic slow that makes you want to bang your head on a desk, but persistence matters. I'd spent my career celebrating persistence. I dusted off that old muscle. Then the paper trail started to smell wrong. At first I thought it was just my paranoia. Vivian's board sent minutes from a meeting that, according to their packet, had approved a revision to the bylaws, one that, among other things, gave the board expanded power to fine residents without a hearing. I asked for the original documents. What they sent back were PDFs that had been clearly altered, dates changed, signatures that looked nearly right but weren't. There were discrepancies in the county filing numbers. It made the hair on my arms stand up. You learn to read documents when you've spent decades specifying load-bearing beams, fonts that don't match, margins that slip, metadata that tells a different story. I took what I had to a paralegal friend who knows her way around the county recorder's office. She pulled the original public filings and the HOA's supposed update, and the contrast was like that between an honest name on a birth certificate and one written later in a shaky hand. So now we're not just arguing about pressure washers. Suddenly I'm a guy with a file folder and a good nose for forgery. I took copies to Ethan Calder, no, not Ethan Reyes from some story you read, Ethan Calder, the county compliance officer who'd answered my first phone call. Ethan had a perpetually furrowed brow and a habit of putting the ends of his sentences on a slow burn, like he was always thinking 2 steps ahead. When he saw the documents he didn't say much, which is the first sign he was taking it seriously. He said, we'll open an audit. Audits, I learned, are the machine parts of justice. Slow, noisy, precise. They jam up when you try to oil them with charm, and they run only on paper. The county sent a notice requesting the HOA's records. The notice landed like a legal cold shower. Vivian's voice on that first response was measured, but I could hear the edge. She scheduled an emergency board meeting and asked that residents refrain from speculation, while the board complied. But compliance, if you bother to read the fine print, is different from cooperation. There were files that couldn't be produced. There were invoices from a shell company, a one-man LLC run by a man named Mark Briggs that had paid for consulting services and community outreach programs that never happened. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed. People who'd been in Vivian's camp began to notice they'd also been charged for things they hadn't approved. Neighbors I'd hardly spoken to joined in with little records of their own: a lawn sign removed, a mailbox painted over without permission, a tree cut down that had been listed as protected in the association's own documents. The web of it started to look less like a single tyrant and more like a small machine of convenience that fed people connected to the board. One night in late summer, someone posted a video to a local community group, grainy, taken from across the street, of a shadow moving through my yard at midnight, flashlight sweeping the hydrangeas. At first, the video didn't make sense to me. Who would be in my yard at midnight? Then I heard, in the distance on the clip, a man's voice saying, get the meters, we need the readings." That's when things got strange in an entirely different way. The video showed a truck with the logo of the HOA on the door. I recognized Vivian's secretary's car. I recognized the gait of a man I'd talked to at meetings. It looked like surveillance. It looked like harassment. I went to the sheriff. Sheriff Pete Lawson is the kind of lawman whose voice makes you feel small and safe at the same time. No nonsense, no spectacle. He came out the next day, took a statement, and left with a little frown. "We'll look into possible trespass," he told me. But there's a difference between "we'll look into" and "we'll stop." And the difference is usually money, motivation, and proof. We kept gathering proof. Roy found an invoice in a box of HOA supplies, an invoice for a community security sweep paid through the Briggs Company, with a date that matched the night of the footage. Another neighbor found a copy of an email trail between Vivian and Mark Briggs discussing routine checks and deterrent strategies. The word deterrent, in that context, sounded more like a threat than a safety measure. When confronted, Vivian insisted the actions were in the community's best interest, that the invoices were for legitimate services, that any meter readings were for maintenance. It's a sobering thing to watch someone shift the frame of a word to make intimidation sound like hygiene. The county audit was rolling forward. Ethan's team subpoenaed bank records. The HOA's treasurer, a woman named Gloria who'd always seemed too gentle to be in any kind of trouble, started to look sick in the meetings. Under pressure, she confessed to signing off on payments she didn't fully understand, trusting Vivian's guidance. That confession, in a room full of neighbors, changed the tone. Fear gave way to shame, and shame to a fragile mobilization. That's when Vivian got ugly. She called a special meeting and read a prepared statement about unjust attacks on her character, accused people of sowing discord, and threatened to pursue legal action personally if she felt defamed. She implied the county had overstepped. She implied we were small-minded. And then she did something that revealed a petty cruelty. She presented a notice that claimed the county's audit was itself improper interference, and suggested that anyone who entertained the county's inquiries might be in violation of the HOA's covenant of neighborly conduct. It's a funny thing about power: the people who wield it often mistake volume for virtue. You can make a speech and call it truth. You can plant signs and call them warnings. But paper unravels if you bother to look at how it's folded. We kept looking. One of the most painful turns came from someone we all trusted, Dennis Loom, a man who'd been chair of the architectural committee for years. Dennis called me one afternoon, voice thin over the line. "Hank," he said, "I didn't want this. I thought Vivian was making us efficient." He told me he'd been handed a stack of template letters and told to rubber stamp them. When he couldn't sleep anymore, he took a USB drive to the county's auditor anonymously. He said he'd seen invoices that matched other payments and that some of the signatures were copied and pasted. He'd been part of the machinery. He was ashamed. He was scared of Vivian, of public fallout, of what would happen to his small house if the neighborhood turned. Dennis's testimony mattered. It put real human hands on the ledger entries. It made it possible to tie expenditures not to community outreach, but to private reimbursements and gifts. It opened the door to criminal inquiry. The sheriff's office, with the county, executed a search warrant on the HOA office. People came with boxes. Laptops were taken. Records were duplicated. Vivian was suspended from the board pending the investigation. She walked out of that meeting with the same composure, but the color had left her face. You could tell she knew things were unraveling. She'd always believed she was the story, the narrator, the person who set the moral compass. But a moral compass needs a magnet to point true, and the magnet in our little town was legal scrutiny. There was one more scene that felt cinematic, like something you'd watch in 3 takes and slow-motion edits. It was the community forum, the one the county held at the high school gymnasium. People turned out rows of folding chairs, fluorescent lights, the smell of coffee and cheap donuts, and the air felt electric. Ethan started with a slide deck, and the slides were plain: dates, amounts, invoices, redline bylaws. The room went quiet. Vivian stood up and, for once, didn't have the scripted cadence. She tried to talk about dedication, about years of volunteer service, about the weight of making community decisions. Then the county attorney read aloud an invoice that paid for a leadership retreat that Vivian had attended, with travel expenses charged to the HOA. In that moment, you saw the audience shift, not like a wave, but a slow, careful tilt. People realizing they'd been paying for the private comforts of someone who'd turned administration into a side income. When the attorney read words that tied Vivian's signature to certain altered minutes and then to the shell company payments, the room's hum became a collective intake of breath. The advantage of a live meeting is to witness the fact that neighbors see each other, and with that seeing comes accountability. Vivian left that night with a polite but firm notice that charges were being considered. She stood in the parking lot and said something to a reporter. "I did what I thought was best," and the sentence felt like both a defense and an epitaph. People argued later that she deserved a chance to explain that mistakes are complex things. Maybe they're right. I don't know if she's a villain in the comic book sense. I do know she preferred to be the person who decided, and that decisions corrupt when left unchecked. The legal process dragged like tar. We had motions, depositions, interviews. Mark Briggs, the man behind the shell company, was quiet at first, then talked. He described small payments and favors, a habit of slipping checks with vague memos. He claimed he believed he was rendering legitimate services. Whether he did or not, he'd helped create the perception that the HOA could act as a private account. Vivian was indicted on charges related to forging documents and misappropriating funds. The news hit the neighborhood like a storm. Some folks said, "It's about time." Others, especially a few who'd been on the board, said it was tragic, that she'd been driven to desperate acts by pressure and the loneliness of leadership. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired, as if we'd all been in a long fight with too many small cuts. We held elections to reconstitute the board. People I'd never thought would run stepped forward. Marlene, a librarian with a sharp mind for bylaws. Joel, who ran a landscaping business and knew how to read contracts. Samira, who organized the children's block party and insisted on transparency. They changed the way meetings were run. Minutes posted online, bank statements open to the community, independent audits every year. The HOA didn't disappear, but it did become less like an instrument of a single will and more like, well, an association of homeowners. And me? I didn't want to be president. I told Joel I'd help with infrastructure, I'd read contracts. I'd consult on gutter projects. I'd review proposals, but I wanted my mornings back. After all this, I spent a Saturday morning drinking coffee on the porch, watching neighborhood kids ride their bikes like they owned the road because they did. It was a relief, but not the kind you can fling like a banner. It was quieter. The case went to trial. The courtroom was small courthouse light coming through narrow windows, reporters lined up, people shifting in their seats. In the end, Vivian was convicted on a couple of counts related to falsifying records and misappropriation. The judge handed down a sentence that included restitution and community service. Some of us left the courthouse feeling like justice had been done. Others felt the system had clipped the wings, but left the bird flapping. There's no clean end to a thing like this. People's reputations are brittle, and once they're cracked, they stay cracked. After the trial, life trickled back toward normal. The neon violation sign came down, replaced by a neutral, welcome sign at the entrance that a committee had designed democratically. The HOA's bank account was audited and reconciled, fines were reviewed, and many refunded. Dennis got a letter from neighbors thanking him for coming clean. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was also a recognition of the courage it took to step out of the machine. He cried when he read it. I shook his hand and felt the weight of frailty we all carry. But if you think it ended neatly with a sign and a refund, you'd be wrong. Systems have cultures, and cultures take longer to change than any one conviction allows. There were people who still felt loyalty to Vivian, who argued that she'd kept certain problems at bay, that she'd made our neighborhood desirable. They were right in a narrow sense. She had, in some ways, created standards that attracted certain buyers. But the point is this: when standards are enforced for personal gain, their moral value evaporates. You can't build a community on curated appearances alone. Here's the thing I want people to take away, not as a lecture, but as a lived fact. Accountability is boring and long and annoying. It involves audits, minutes, invoices, conversations with sleepy county clerks. It's the thing that wears you down. But it's also the thing that keeps small tyrannies from becoming big tragedies. If you want a community where decisions are sensible and fair, you have to be willing to show up and read the minutes, to ask how funds are used, to talk to your neighbors about otherwise mundane things like bank reconciliations. It's not glamorous, but it's the work. I still get messages sometimes from people who say, "Hank, tell me how you knew to look." The answer is simple, maybe too simple. I was stubborn, and I saved my paperwork. I read things the way an engineer reads blueprints. Inconsistencies jump out if you pay attention. And I had people who cared enough to check things with me, neighbors who didn't want to be bullied. Courage is rarely a lone act. Courage is often a chorus. There's also the human faintness of sympathy. I find myself, even now, thinking about Vivian on a Tuesday sitting in a gray apartment, probably, measuring her life in calendars and reminders. I don't wish ill on her. I wish she'd found another way to feel useful. I wish her hunger for control had been transformed into service. But wishing is not the same as enabling. We learned that the hard way. If you're watching this and you live in a community governed by covenants, or if you're in a neighborhood with a strong HOA presence, here are two practical things, plain and simple. Keep every official notice, every email, every piece of paper, and insist on regular, independent audits of association finances. Ask who signs checks and why. Suggest having an ombudsman or at least a neutral person to which complaints can be escalated. Make it boring to cheat, because people who are tempted to misuse power like flashy windows where the light won't shine in. And one more thing, don't let eloquence stand in for accountability. Vivian spoke beautifully. Her voice made people listen. But sometimes the most persuasive person is the loudest liar. Don't confuse a good speech for good stewardship. This story isn't only about my truck or an HOA that went bad. It's about the way small communities bend under pressure. It's about how people sometimes conflate leadership with ownership, and how the mundane things, minutes, invoices, signatures, are where the real moral work happens. It's about neighbors who, together, turned a small pattern of abuses into a public record, and how that record made a difference. So tell me in the comments below, tell me what you think. Have you ever seen something similar where someone in charge started to confuse the public good with personal gain? Did your community fix it? Or did it hide it under nicer landscaping and tighter rules? How would you have handled Vivian differently, if at all? Be honest. Be civil. If you found this useful, share this with someone who lives in an HOA, or with a neighbor who complains but thinks nothing can change. And if you've got your own story of a small victory, a neighbor who stood up, an audit that found the truth, a meeting that turned the tide, tell it here. We learn from the boring stuff, the paperwork, the slow work of insisting on transparency, and your experience might be the nudge someone else needs to start looking at their own community's records. If you want more stories like this, honest, messy, true-to-life tales about neighbors and power, and the weird things that happen when a small group of people try to govern a small patch of the world, hit subscribe, share, and leave a comment. I'll keep telling what I know, not because it makes me a hero, but because it reminds us that communities are not built by rules alone, but by the steady, sometimes inconvenient patience of people who show up and pay attention.